Welcome to the latest installment of the Quebec and New England Layout Expansion. Today's video is all about building roadways and roadway crossings. In our last video, we mapped out the location of the 6-track road crossing. Throughout this video, you are going to see evidence of stealing from Boomer Diorama or getting a lot of inspiration from Boomer's channel when it comes to building and painting roads. The base structure for all my roads is 1/8 inch balsa, which I was only able to get in 2-inch wide strips. So you will see that I kind of created a jigsaw puzzle to get the road width that I needed, either the 3 1/4 inch main road crossing here or the 2.5 inch crossing later in the video. In all cases, I used paper cutouts, which were created by tracing along the lines that I had drawn on the layout, and then transferred those shapes onto the balsa. For the track crossings themselves, I used the pencil rubbing method over paper to get the exact location of the rails. I gave the balsa a good coat of varathane before gluing it in place so that I wouldn't get any varathane on the rails. I also made sure to put a coat of varathane on the underside of the balsa where it was trimmed back to lay on top of the ends of the ties. I put a drop of ACC on the ends of each tie and wood glue where the balsa would be making direct contact with the base of the layout. Heavy cardboard shims were used to fill the gap created by the cork roadbed on the main yard tracks. For this large area, I didn't want to create it using 2-inch strips of balsa, so I traced the area onto tracing paper and then transferred it onto a piece of masonite or hardboard using a sharp knife. I used the narrow scrolling blade in my jigsaw to cut out the sharp curves in the plan. The 1/8 inch thickness of the hardboard translates to about 11 inches in HO scale. Since I had decided previously not to raise the buildings to the top of rail, I realized I had to ramp down the roadway to the loading docks. In order to keep that grade to a reasonable level, I realized I'd have to cut off a section of this board and start the ramping down towards the building where it's at 0 elevation. I notched the underside of the board where it would have to sit on the ties of the first track in the yard. Once this piece was glued in place, I can then begin the road, the 2.5 inch wide road that extends parallel to the yard across the layout. This was a tricky bit. I was dreading having to do this, but I know the finished look will be great. So I used craft paper to trace the track, basically, the tops of the rails, so that the balsa could be cut out to fit in between the tracks and across the tracks. Step 1 is to cut out and test fit the paper template. Step 2 is to transfer the paper template onto a piece of 2-inch wide balsa. Step 3 is to find a scrap piece of balsa that's a 1/2 inch wide to fill out the full width of the road. We'll have to wait a bit for that, but we'll save the paper template for now, as that will be used to size the missing piece. The process is then repeated for the other 3 quadrants of the diamond. A small scrap piece of balsa was used to fill the center of the diamond. This piece, along with the top and bottom pieces, the narrow strips, they needed to be filleted because they were sitting on top of ballast and the 1/8 inch thickness would be much too high beyond the top of rail. They also had to be notched where they'd be sitting on top of the ties, tie plates, and spikes. Cardboard shims were required on the top piece where I hadn't filled out the ballast. And after all that cutting and fitting, we found a spare piece to fill out the first section, that missing 1/2 inch strip. Now here you can see the challenges of trying to make a road with multiple curves using long straight sections of balsa. It really was a jigsaw puzzle, but in the end I finally got a long straight section out of it. I had to cut that missing 1/2 inch strip from a fresh package of balsa, but the remaining 1.5 inch wide strip did not go to waste, as you will see soon. Shims were used once again to ramp back down to the baseline because of the cork that was used underneath the tracks in the yard. One by one, each of the roadway sections was glued down with a lot of weight on it to make sure it was flat, level. This photo is a little bit out of sequence, but I remembered and had to come back to add the entrances to the doorways, the truck door and the office door, so that they would be level with the top of the road. I found the easiest way to do the intersection was to create a piece that butts up perfectly perpendicular to the main road and have both curves on the one piece that you're adding. This secondary service road is meant to provide access to the water tank, which will be to the left. You see where X marks the spot, and the recovery boiler house to the right. But it was also meant to provide access to the railroad employees and their internal yard service road network. That meant narrower roads, plank crossings, etc. The question I was grappling with was whether the asphalt should carry right up to the edge of the first rail or whether it should stop short and have gravel infield, because it is, after all, just an internal service road. Ultimately, I decided to cut the asphalt short, fill in that space beyond the asphalt to the plank crossing with gravel. I also decided on making the plank crossing 2 planks wide. It is, after all, only 18 feet. With that settled, I'm going to eventually have to figure out how to actually make the plank crossings. What you see here is temporary. I made these by splitting a coffee stirrer stick down the middle and then chopping it in a scale, 10 foot, I think, length. They're a tad too thick, and while I know I can sand them down, I want to use actual scale lumber. Ideally, that means a 6-inch by 10-inch or 6-inch by 8-inch cross-section lumber strip, but unfortunately, they're nowhere to be found. The best I could do is tripling up some 2x8s that I already have on hand, or using 6x12s and shaving them down to 10 inches. 10-inch boards means they're 4 across with room for a flangeway. 8-inch boards means I can fit 5 planks across. Not sure which is the most likely for a small railroad. I've seen both sizes on major prototypes like CN. After cutting out a few more jigsaw puzzle pieces to round the corner from the main road, I ended up at the coal unloading shed, where I figured I needed to do something a little different. Since I've never been inside an actual coal unloading shed, and I wanted to preserve the area between the rails for possibly cutting through to simulate an unloading trough, I trimmed away the ballast on both sides of the ties and brought the roadway or asphalt right up to the ties on both sides. I'll probably paint this concrete rather than an asphalt color, at least under the building itself, to simulate the foundation. And here's a couple of views of what it will look like with all the buildings back in place. All that's left to do now is to continue the road up to the face of the power plant main building. And you can see by the pencil marks that I had multiple different ideas about how wide the road should be, whether it should follow closer to the track or further away from the track. Eventually, I landed on this idea that I shaded in pencil, which I then traced with paper to use as a template to cut the balsa wood. Luckily, it fit almost completely on two pieces of balsa 2 inches wide. I just had one corner to add to finish it off. And here's a look at it after it was installed, glued in place, with a little bit of a shim at the face of the building to make sure the top of the balsa matched the floor of the building where the doors are. I went back and sanded the entire roadway length, everywhere there was balsa, to make sure all of the seams between the various bits and pieces that were glued together were at the same level. And then I went back again and basically shaved the edges to simulate a bit of a undulating profile, because it was too exact. An 1/8 inch all the way along everywhere is too uniform. And then followed that up with a sharp blade anywhere there was a track crossing to make sure that the top of the balsa was just a little bit lower than the top of the railhead itself, as I knew I had to come back in with some paste for texture. This is a screen grab from one of Boomer Diorama's many tutorials on road crossings. It's easy to follow, get the right parts, and off you go. I was able to find the evergreen sheet styrene and the angles, but I couldn't find the 4x4 square strips that he showed how he used in later videos as blockers to prevent the goop from getting into the flangeways. In his earlier videos, he showed how he just used basically 1/16 inch strip to slide along as he was gluing in the angles. But that works out to like 0.60 or a little bit more. And I felt that was too wide a gap for the flange. So I set about trying to find from my scrap pile something that I could use that's roughly 0.40 to 0.50 in thickness. To account for the variability in wheel sets and gauge, I settled on this styrene from a Pike Stuff kit, which is about 0.54 wide. Turns out it's a perfect fit, matching the Walters guide rail spacing on their turnouts. Following the tutorial, the first thing I did was rough up the top of the ties so that the 020 styrene could be CA'd to it as a base. I cut the angle strips a little bit longer than the crossing per prototype, and then trimmed the corners so it's not an abrupt 90-degree end to them. Before gluing them in, I painted what would be the visible side of the angles, a Floqual roof brown or tie brown color. I used the very noxious glue from Tamiya for the first crossing, and then quickly reverted back to my usual Plastruc Weldine, which is non-toxic. It turns out that you don't need an instant bond, and sometimes it's better to have a little bit of play time before the glue sets. The process was then repeated for the other 5 main road crossings. For the diamond crossing, I once again used the craft paper tracing that I had made of the tracks to cut out the styrene base plates. If you're wondering about those dark spots in the middle of the base plates, those are actually holes that I cut out to allow the styrene to lay flat over the heads of the track nails. The last step I took before starting to pour in the infill paste was to cut some small pieces of cork to plug up the ends of the crossings between the rails. Just make sure when you're pouring the plaster or paste, it doesn't flow onto too many ties beyond the actual crossing, which would be hard to clean up and wouldn't look too prototypical. I also managed to find some wood strips that were 4 inch by 4 inch scale lumber, and so those were handy to test clearances, and it turns out, as you'll see later in the video, that they're also useful when pouring the goop. I wanted to experiment a little bit before jumping in with both feet, as I'd never done this sort of thing before. So, since I didn't want to build up too many layers upward, otherwise the road would be bumpy, if I can say that, I thought, well, balsa is a soft wood. I can create depressions in the road and then fill it in with some of this crackle paste to see what it would look like when it crackles. I used a plastic LED light bulb to create some gentle depressions, filled it in with the Liquitex crackle paste, and set it aside to dry. While that was going on, I filled in the first crossing with modeling paste, using a small palette knife to somewhat level it across the rails and 4x4s in the flangeways. Turns out the wood 4x4s work just as well as the evergreen strips would have worked, and they're reusable. Just clean them up, pull them out before they set too hard, and you can use them again and again. I also experimented with the plain modeling paste and a thin layer across the roadway to see what that would look like when it dried out. It turns out the crackle paste is a little hit and miss. As you can see by this first test here, it curled upward and away from the balsa. And here you can see the crackle paste just peeled off. I figured maybe it was because the indent that I made with the light bulb was too smooth. So I tried a rougher approach. It's neat what you can do with soft wood, isn't it? So I filled up this new hole with crackle paste again, and while it was drying, I went back to the road crossing. There's a bit of shrinking that goes on with the modeling paste, I think, and so there was plenty of depth there to add a layer of crackle paste on top of it. And this is what it looks like when it dried. Very, very interesting. And with a touch of very diluted paint, those cracks really pop out. The second crackle paste test on the roadway turned out a little better. There is still some raising of the edges and curling as it dries, but that can easily be knocked down with a bit of sanding. Getting back to the modeling paste test, it dries nicely, but needs a bit of sanding. And one of the lessons learned here is not to sand it too much because it easily becomes shiny. One of the other things I wanted to try and duplicate were ruts created by heavy trucks in the asphalt. So here you see I've made some indents with a chisel and filled it in with crackle paste to see what it would look like. I then added a few more patches of crumbling asphalt, and also along the center line of the road I engraved with a fine point dentist pick those longitudinal cracks that you see along most roads. With confidence overflowing, I proceeded to fill in the rest of the crossing. Didn't look too bad, I thought. But don't let this interesting photo fool you. My overconfidence got me in trouble when I started to paint. Well, I didn't throw away the paint that I used on the original layout for the roads. It was a concoction of all manner of things to get that gray color that you think is asphalt. But I quickly realized it's not going to work for what we're doing here. It's of unknown origin in terms of the pigments, and latex paint's probably mixed in there. So it's not what we want to use for thin washes a la Boomer. So we're going to put that aside. Now I know this runs against the grain about going all this way with this method and then using cheap acrylics, but I was in my experimental phase, so I went ahead. I was generally happy with the mixture and color that I was getting between gray and charcoal and a drop of asphalt, but when you look more closely, you can see where the problems started to crop up. As I mentioned previously, over-sanding the modeling paste gives it a shiny texture, which doesn't appear to take the paint as well. So you have large patches of light color and darker color where the crackle paste is. The most annoying bits was where areas of crackle paste would absolutely not take color. Yes, the dark color went in the cracks, but it didn't seem like the surface of the crackle paste was taking any of the paint. I was also annoyed at myself for not using a wetting agent to make sure I didn't get brush strokes. So at this point, probably as a result of a lack of patience on my part, or talent, I tried two drastic experiments. On the one hand, trying to remove the paint through sanding and water, and on the other hand, trying to add a thicker coat. Naturally, this practically obscured all of the crackle paste texture. And so the experimentation continued with a fresh skim coat of crackle paste on the lower section and a light base coat of pale gray on the top section. The crackle paste did its job. Too much. I think less is more probably when using crackle paste, but here you can see the entire section is crackled. Unfortunately, patience is becoming less of a virtue with me as I get older, and I probably should have added a skim coat of sand texture or modeling paste again, but I didn't have the sand texture and I didn't want to use the modeling paste because it's too shiny, so I went ahead with painting. It was at this point that I also decided to try a different paint, if you'll call it that. It's the Woodland Scenics Asphalt, which is really a stain rather than a paint. Well, this lower section is passable, I think. I'm still concerned about this middle section right here. In my experimentation, I did not give it the light wash of this pale gray as a base before the darker asphalt color. As a result, it's getting harder to get that darker gray to fill in the crackle paste. So I'm trying targeted washes of the darker gray on the crackle paste areas to see if that will work. In the meantime, I've carried on with with additional coats on the road crossings. And at this point, I don't feel that there's too much more to add to this particular video. I'm going to press ahead, and if there's something to share in the next construction update, I will do so. But for now, please leave me your thoughts and comments. Keep in mind that I think it looks better on the video than it does in person, so we'll see how things evolve. As always, thank you for watching. If you enjoy layout improvement videos, here are a few others that you may find interesting. If you're not already a subscriber, you can click on the logo on the top right-hand corner of your screen.